Everybody, welcome back to the next part in my Helix in the Studio series. The last episode I did layering guitars part 1, and there is going to be a part 2 coming up, but I wanted to do this video in between. In the last video, some very astute viewers, there's a couple of them, I can't remember the names, sorry guys, but they brought up the question as to whether I was using stereo tracks and how that would affect the delays and whatnot that I had on some of the tracks that I was using. And I thought it would be a really good opportunity to discuss the stereo versus mono topic, both within our Helix and when creating presets, but also in the studio when recording to a DAW. So let's dive right into this. And like I said, a lot of folks have asked me over the last little while, why do you make your presets in stereo? Or why don't you make them in mono? I'm not going to use a preset because it's in stereo. I'd love to, but it's in stereo and I only play in mono, so I'm not going to do it. Well, there's a couple interesting things to keep in mind. And let's go over, first of all, to HX Edit and take a look at a Helix preset and a few key things we need to worry about when we're dealing with Helix. But then we'll go over to Cubase and talk about when we're recording a few key things to keep in mind. Okay, so let's go over to HX Edit right now. So what I've done is I've created a preset, just to give you a quick rundown. I didn't dial this in any special way. I have an amp, I have a dual cab block that's turned off. I have a single cab block. I have a stereo EQ, stereo delay, a legacy reverb, which is in stereo. I have a stereo parametric EQ, stereo compressor, and a bypassed mono gain block at the end. Okay, and you'll see why I put that there. So here's the thing about stereo and mono. That's very important to know on a Helix preset. A guitar is a mono source. Okay, there's no two ways about it. Unless we do something to make it stereo or stereoize it, a guitar running into an amp is just a mono source coming out of our speakers. There's nothing there to make it stereo. We can place that in a recording in the stereo fields using our pan control, like I showed in some of the previous videos in this series, but it's still just a mono signal. But there's a number of things in a Helix preset that we need to know. Now, one of the first things, and this is why I have the dual cab block up here. When we put a dual cab block, a lot of folks like to use two different cabs, maybe with two different mics. The default setting on that for the Helix is that one of the cabs, in this case I change it to a 412 greenback 25 and a 212 match H30, one with, let me just turn this on so we can see that a little bit better. I'll turn the single cab off. The 212 match H30 I have a 57 dynamic, 1.5 inches back. The 412 greenback 25 I have a 121 ribbon, 1 inch back. Not that any of that's really important. The settings aren't important here. But by default the Helix pans those two cabinets hard left and right to give us stereo. So now we've turned our mono guitar signal into a stereo guitar signal. If I grab my guitar, we can hear that. If I go to a single cab, really try to listen on headphones maybe, that'll really help you to hear this, or at least a good set of speakers, with a sort of sitting in the middle so you can hear the stereo spread. So here's mono, the single cab, here's the dual cab. Another way I can do this, and this is a really important point on making Helix presets. If you have a stereo path and you stick any mono block after stereo blocks, it collapses everything to mono. So what I have here is I have a mono gain block. It's not affecting the sound in any other way other than when I turn it on, it collapses everything to mono. So this is a trick we can use if we have a stereo preset that we want to collapse to mono. So listen to the cab here again. I turn the block on, off. We get our stereo spread between cabinets. That collapses them to mono. Okay, so this is interesting. Anything that I put after any stereo blocks, any mono block I put after them, is going to collapse everything straight to mono. Can be a useful tool, but it's very important to know. Okay, so let's just get rid of this for now, our stereo block. I'll just go back to utilizing my single cab here. And I'll turn that off so that we're back in stereo mode. Okay, so here's the interesting thing now. I'm running a mono amp, obviously. Amps are mono. I'm running that into a mono cab, a single mono cab, into a stereo EQ. Now, this is what's interesting about this. This is a stereo EQ block, but there's really nothing stereo about it. I'm not able with this EQ to affect the right or left hand signals differently. If I could, let's say, use the high and low shelf and boost all the frequencies on one side more so than the other, now we would have stereo again, okay? But we're not able to do that with this. So while it's a stereo block to allow a stereo signal to pass through it, it's not really a stereo block. So by adding that into the path, I'm not really making the signal stereo or mono. It's just going to retain whatever it was before. So if I send a mono signal through that stereo block, it's not becoming stereo sounding, it's just remaining mono sounding. And I'll use the word sounding because yes, technically it is a stereo block and a stereo preset, but it's not going to sound stereo. And that's a really important point in this video. Just because a preset is stereo doesn't mean it sounds stereo. Very, very important point, okay? Now I go into a stereo delay. We'll come back to that in a second. This reverb is stereo. So the only thing really, and again, if we go to the EQ, this is stereo, but again, it's not doing anything to differentiate the left versus the right. It's processing both of them the same way. And the compressor also is processing both sides the same way. So these EQ blocks and compression are not doing anything to make it sound more stereo. The reverb, on the other hand, is in stereo, and it will make it sound stereo. But let's do this. Let's listen to the bit of reverb here. Now, let's click on the mono block at the end to collapse that to mono. Okay, there's a difference. The reverb's not huge to begin with, right? So I usually say, you know, if I'm playing with that reverb, whether I'm just taking the left side or the right side or collapsing it to mono, it's probably not going to be a huge deal breaker. Now, if we made a huge big hall reverb, and the more pronounced that reverb is, it might be a bigger deal, right? So this brings up an interesting point. If you have a stereo preset with, let's say, you know, some stereo effects on it, and we wanted to run to, let's say, front of house, so that it remained in stereo. If our, you know, front of house is actually running in stereo and not mono, that's another thing we got to take into account. We say, well, how could I run stereo to the front of house, but let's say maybe we just have a mono monitor on stage, and you just want to collapse that. Well, one interesting thing you could do is you could always grab this block, pull it down, pull this down like so. Now we have a split off of the top path here that's going to come straight down here. We could set this to, let's say, I don't know, maybe our XLR outputs to send, or quarter-inch output to send to a power cab, right? So now what we would have done is collapsed our signal to mono to send to our power cab, and maybe set this to XLR so we can still get our stereo path going out to front of house, if that makes any sense. So that's a possibility if our preset is set up in a way that we have the available blocks and whatnot to do that. But that's a totally different point, but an interesting point nonetheless. Because the problem is, if we simply take a left or right signal, we're only going to get the left side of the effects or the right side of the effects. It's not going to sum it to mono. We're just going to take it, we're going to lose some information. Hopefully that's clear. That's a little side point. So with the way I set up my presets, and whether I'm talking about custom tone or marketplace, my reverb is usually not so big that if we take one side or the other, that it's going to make a dramatic effect. And I do that on purpose. So that even though it's a stereo preset, we can run it in mono and it's going to sound okay. So any of my presets you see in stereo, 99.9% of the time, they're going to be perfectly acceptable in mono as well. You're not really going to lose much of anything. Is it going to sound mildly different in the reverb? Yeah, but everywhere else it's not. Now, let's go to the delay. This is where it gets even more noticeable though and really important. Now, I use a stereo block here. Now, a lot of people say, well, why don't you just use a mono one? Well, you can't make everybody happy, and this is the problem. Everybody has a different purpose, right? Some people like stereo, some people like mono. Some people run stereo setups, some people run mono setups. It's really silly to run, you know, an overtly stereo sounding preset into a mono cab or mono power cab, let's say, and we'd really be losing out on the stereo effect of everything, right? So, but again, like I said, we can sum that to mono. So with the delay though, just because this is a stereo delay again does not mean that it's going to be a stereo sounding delay. And I recently did a video dialing in the transistor tape, and I talked quite in depth about how a stereo delay can actually just sound mono. So we might be thinking, oh, I've got this great stereo effect, but it's not actually in stereo. And here's an example. So here is the transistor tape turned on. I've set the mix fairly high just so we can really hear the examples. Okay, so we see we have a stereo block. Fine. That's just a mono delay. Or depending on the settings, right? Now, if I was to take my wow and flutter way up and then put my spread way up, now I've got some stereo effect. And I talked about this in the dialing in transistor tape. So let's just keep those spread and wow and flutter way down. Even if we had them just up subtly, it's stereo. The more you have the wow and flutter and the spread up, the more stereo effect you're going to get. But it's not going to be dramatic until you get to kind of heavier settings. Okay, it's going to be a sort of a dimmer switch effect, right? It's going to grow in its stereoization, if we can call it. The other important control is scale. So if I put that to 50%, now we're going to bounce some echoes around. Okay, I have my normal setting of quarter note over here in the left channel, and it's bouncing kind of an eighth note over here in the right channel. Okay, so that's definitely in stereo now. So if I turn on my mono block at the end, listen to what happens. So here's a stereo. Mono block on. Mono block off. Mono block on. It collapses it back to mono. But that's going to be a very different sound than if I monoize it in here, because you see, the scale is actually adding a different rhythmic value to the effect. So it's interesting. It depends on what you want. There's no right or wrong setting here. We just want to understand how it all works. Okay, so I can monoize that delay. I have the mono block at the end off. And somehow this changed to dots, sorry. So even though this is a stereo path, a stereo preset technically, with stereo effects, there's very little going on in here that makes it stereo, if that makes sense. Very little. The reverb a little bit, but so little that even if we split just the left or the right off, this is still a perfectly usable preset, right? So when I dial in my tones, most of the time, I put a stereo delay, let's say, and I will then set it so that it's very mono or just mildly stereo, so that if somebody does use it in mono, they're not going to really notice any adverse effects from that. It's going to work perfectly fine. It's going to sound okay, but it also gives them the option, if they ever want to stereoize it, they could simply move their scale or their wow and flutter and spread around and create a bigger stereo effect, instead of starting with a mono block and then having to change the whole block out, do all your settings again just to make it stereo. So I always like to keep everything stereo, even if I'm not utilizing the stereo-ness or the stereo sound of it. I hope that makes sense, okay? So this is why when I now came back to Cubase and said in the recording, which is what this series is about, Helix in the Studio, when I'm recording a preset that is a stereo preset but doesn't really have any overt stereo sounding qualities to it, well, then I can start panning that around and not really worry too much. So let's do this. Let's stick with our rather stereoized effect here. Okay, and we'll go over to Cubase. Okay, so here we are in Cubase. Now, what you'll see here is I have these guitar tracks set up, this here shows that, you see the two circles where my mouse is? That's a stereo track. This one down here is a mono track, okay? So if I was to record the guitar that just kind of shows off this stereo delay here. Okay, so let's put our guitar down. We'll stop that. I'm going to set this so that it can just maybe loop around here. And there we go. So that should just loop now. So we hear the delays bouncing around. Now if I come over in that case, and I use my panner here. In Cubase, we have two types of panners. We can take this little select panner arrow, and it says stereo combined panner or stereo balance panner. Now, stereo balance panner, what it's going to do is, if I pan this, okay, it is going to affect the volume balance between the left and the right side information. So if I panned this all the way to the left, that would mean that I would lose my right hand information, and the more I panned it, the more that right hand stereo information, right side stereo information sound would go down. Listen to that. So here, as I play this and it loops, listen to what happens as I pan that to the left. See how all the right side information is gone? If I go to the right, I'll play this again. I'm going to just shorten this up a bit so it loops quicker. I'm going to play this again. I'll pan to the right. So that really changes things. That could be a very damaging thing to use in the wrong situation. In this case, if I really wanted all those repeats there and I use that panner, I'm losing it, or I'm at least lowering the volume of one side as I move it over. So what's the solution to that? What if we wanted to move that signal to the left or the right to maybe mix it better with whatever we're playing it with, but we didn't want to lose that information? Well, we go over to what we call the stereo combined panner. And you can see we can move this in a number of ways. We can have a setting for left, a setting for right, and then move them all together as well. Okay? So if I just center that off, so it's all up the middle, we're going to get what we heard before. But let's say I want to move that so it's more over in the left side of the stereo spectrum, but still have that effect. Watch what I can do. I can grab the right side. So as I move it over there, what ends up happening is it goes into mono, but I don't lose that information, okay? So I'm still getting my stereo sound, but it's monoized, it's collapsed to mono. So with this, instead of the balance panner, if I go all the way to left, I'm not collapsing it to mono, I'm losing information, I'm losing stereo information. If I go to the combined panner and I move it all the way to the left, I'm just collapsing it to mono. So as I move this panner over more, I just kind of collapse it more and more and more to mono. And same thing as if I went to the right side. If you notice also, it was clipping a little bit before. The volume also increases because we're piling all that information into one spot. So, I mean, if you were to do that, you'd probably want to bring your volume down a bit. as you can see there. So does that make sense? So here's the thing now. The presets I was using in the previous videos, and this goes back to the questions I received. You might say, well, wait, you weren't using the combined panner. You were using the balance panner. I was like, yeah, because although I was recording on a stereo track here, as you can see, there's different information on two sides, right? Here's your left, here's your right. We have a repeat here. Right, so there's left, right, left, left, right, left, left, right, left. Sounds like I'm in the military. And so we see it's a stereo track. If it was a mono track, we'd have one single wave file. So a lot of folks say, well, wait a second, you know, you have a stereo preset and then you're panning it. What's going to happen to the delays? Well, the delays were never set to sound stereo, right? They were set to sound mono, even though it was a stereo path in the Helix. So I recorded to a stereo track. Now, okay, the reverb, yeah, okay, if I pan that all the way over, I'm going to lose the right side of the reverb, but it was such a subtle amount of reverb anyways in a lot of the presets. And I find even if it isn't, it still sort of kind of just gives the effect to my ears of just collapsing to mono anyway. So it's never something that's bothered me. Other folks it might bother, they might find that doesn't work as well for them. And that's fine. I mean, we're all going to have different ways of working and there's no right or wrong. It's whatever in the end gives our ears kind of what they want to hear, right? So if I do pan it out and I hear the reverb do something, oh, that sounds okay to me. I'm not going to go change that, right? But, you know, you could also just go to your Helix preset, put a mono block after it, collapse it to mono and record it all to a mono track. That's fine too, right? I don't know if I've ever actually gone and A/B'd them right side by side to hear whether there's a huge difference or not. I just kind of use my ears in the moment with what I'm doing and I go, nah, that works too. But another option I could have done is just used the different style panner, right? The stereo combined panner, and just moved it over so that essentially it would have collapsed it to mono rather than just picking one side of it. Again, huge difference in it. Not really certain if we would have noticed, but let's take a look. Okay, so here I am back in Cubase in the project I used in the last Helix in the studio video, and this is using my Essex preset pack from the Line 6 Marketplace. Preset pack I really enjoy using actually. So here's the difference now. It's a stereo track that's taking advantage of that little tiny bit of stereo reverb. So let's listen to the difference between using the balance panner and the combined panner, okay? I'm gonna have to do some edits so you can hear this smoothly. I'll switch back and forth between them and you can hear whether you notice a huge difference in that reverb, which is the only thing in here that would be in stereo. So keep in mind, when I'm on the balance panner all the way to the left, okay, and I'm gonna set this up at 0, when I'm there, what we're hearing is just the left side of the reverb, not collapsed to mono, but just the left side of it. So we're technically losing the right-hand side stereo information of the reverb. Let's listen to that. And then when I go over to the combined panner, then we're going to hear the full stereo information collapse to mono. Okay, let's take a listen back and forth to that a couple of times. We'll start off with the balance panner. What do you guys think? Inevitably, there has to be some difference because it is different. My point is the difference negligible or is the difference so big that we should do it one way or the other? Well, that's really going to come down to personal preference and also to the point of, is it even noticeable enough to worry about? Never mind being played solo, but in a mix, right? There's a little more reverb on this than I would normally use, but I still just don't get too bent out of shape over it. My ears tell me as I'm mixing and as I'm playing that, you know what, even if I just take the left or the right side of the reverb or collapse it to mono or whatever, I'm still fine anyway. I don't get too worked up about those little differences and changes. So I think that's a good example of how we can utilize our panners within Cubase depending on the situation we need and want. And also knowing the ins and outs that we don't want to do any damage if we do have stereo effects or stereo sounds, that we don't want to inadvertently lose some of that stereo-ness, right? Just because we don't understand the tools that we're using. So that also goes back to Helix, right? Always remember that a guitar is inherently just a mono signal until we do something to differentiate the signals in the left and right hand speakers or ears in our headphones. However we're listening. That could be with a chorus, that could be with a delay, that could be with a reverb, it could be with a number of different things. Far too vast number of ways to change that to even discuss here. But we have to remember that as soon as we turn it into a stereo signal by going through a stereo block, any mono block after that is going to make us lose the stereo sound. It's going to collapse it to mono so that all of that information gets collapsed to mono and gets sent to as a mono signal. That's very different than just taking the left hand output or the right hand output, right? If we just take, let's say, the right hand output and send that out, that's not going to sum it to mono or collapse it to mono. That's just going to give us one side of the information. Kind of like what I showed inside of Cubase as well, right? We have two possibilities. We can use a stereo combined panner to collapse something to mono by panning it, or just lessen the width of it, right? Or we could use the balance panner to actually change the balance between the left side and right side, even getting rid of one side. Is there a right and wrong way to work? No, I don't think so. It's really dependent on your needs. And I say this about everything, right? I like to present pieces of information, but I don't want to come across as saying that my opinion's the only one that matters and that's you have to listen to me because this. No, that's ridiculous. There's so many great tools here and everybody's going to have a different desired outcome. And as long as we understand how the tools work, that's the really important point so that we get the results we want. Not, attempting to get a certain result, but then not getting it because we just didn't understand how the tools work or we didn't understand how everything came together. I think that's all I wanted to cover with this. So I hope that answers the questions as to a couple things that I wanted this to cover, is how we can use mono or stereo tracks in our DAW, how we have to be careful about panning those around so that we understand the difference between the balance panner and the combined panner. And also about why my Helix presets are oftentimes stereo presets, but I do that so that they're much more flexible. They're designed to be stereo, but there's very little stereo sound coming out of it, but very easy to add more, right? Somebody wants to add a stereo chorus, they put it in. Now they're not going to run the danger of that being collapsed to mono because there's a mono delay block after it, even though that delay block is sounding mono or very close to mono, right? There's very wide stereo and there's very narrow stereo, right? It's a complicated thing at times to get your head around. Mono is one thing straight up the middle, right? The same thing coming out of both speakers. But stereo can be very wide or it can be very narrow. And knowing that and understanding these tools allows us to be able to just basically take care of whatever situation we're in and get the desired results we want. I hope I was clear on that, guys. If you have any questions, leave them to me in the comments. I'll try and get to them. I can't always get to all of them, but I hope that was helpful. And I'll be back soon with the Helix in the Studio Layering Guitars Part 2, which is going to be some fun and interesting stuff in there as well. Thank you guys so much for tuning in. Please like the video and share it if you don't mind. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. And hit the bell notification so that you get notified when I add new videos. And I'll be back soon. Thanks again so much for your time and tuning in. Ciao for now.